A little over a year ago, Frieren Beyond Journey's End started airing, and its impact was pretty immediately noticeable. Not only did it usurp Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood as the best reviewed anime on my anime list, it did it by a large margin, while also maintaining a general appeal beyond just critical acclaim. A lot of people really like this show, me included. However, there's one criticism that I've seen at the forefront of why many people don't like it. They call it boring. Now, the interesting thing about this criticism is I kinda get it, except I think it's what makes the show so good. Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when boring is better. Part of what makes this criticism so interesting to me is that I don't inherently disagree with it. I think it's very reasonable for someone to sit down and watch Frieren and be bored. Now, that doesn't mean that I think Frieren is a boring show. I just understand why some people might experience it that way. So what differentiates a boring show from one that some people can find boring? I think there are two major factors. The first is the intention behind the story, and the second is whether or not it was worth it. Pacing in storytelling is incredibly difficult and finicky. There are rules taught over and over again across many different types of storytelling about when inciting incidents are supposed to happen, like the 17-page rule in screenwriting. Being intentional with your decisions surrounding pacing is essential to writing a good story. Authors and educators constantly talk about setting up expectations for your audience, giving them enough to be engaged while also setting up the rest of the story. But the thing about standards is as they become more normal, eventually they become expectations. And with expectations is room to subvert. So when it comes to pacing, authors can intend to do something different. Subversion is something I talk about a lot on my channel because no piece of media exists in a vacuum, and audiences' expectations, completely independent of the quality of a product, will influence their viewing experience. This is the first part of what I'm arguing surrounding Frieren, that it's very intentional with its pacing. That pacing just happens to be slow and very measured. Because this show isn't really centered around conflict and it takes its time, but it also does so much with so little, consistently telling entire fleshed out and engaging stories in just half an episode. Take for example my most recent video where I argued that Frieren's strongest episode might be one that people didn't notice. The video was focused on episode 14 and why I argued it might be the strongest episode in the entire first season. The first half of that entire episode doesn't really center around any significant conflict, just a small disagreement within the party. Many people could argue that it's slow and I wouldn't disagree, but I was so invested in the characters and substance as to what they were exploring that the space actually lended itself to a much better viewing experience. It's slow but deliberate and really engaging, and this is far from the first time that this show has built an entire story around things that you wouldn't really expect. The first video I made talking about Frieren that got into the algorithm was discussing episode 2, specifically the first 9 minutes, and how they told a fully encapsulated story so efficiently. In universe, years passed in those 9 minutes. So how can Frieren be a show that doesn't rush in the slightest, but is still incredibly efficient with the time it does use? Every episode for the first 20 feels like multiple unique stories being told in such a short period of time. Doing that is really hard, and it's done so well. Because for that slow, intentional pacing to work, it has to feel worth it by the end. There was this old rule I was taught when learning how to write that I think is really interesting. You shouldn't follow it too much to the T, but the idea is that every chapter should be able to function as a standalone story, which also can be applied to a television series or anime. What if each episode could be a satisfying viewer experience without context or the rest of the story? It's easier as an ideal, but last week when I showed a friend episode 14 as I was working on the previous video, I was surprised how well the episode held up out of context. Having never seen an episode of Frieren or really knowing much about the show, she was able to follow along really well. While it was better in context, it was functional without it. But that requires each episode to follow general storytelling structure with satisfying conclusions. Because the second part of what makes Frieren's slow and deliberate pacing so effective is how satisfying the emotional crescendos are. Anything that could be defined as a slow burn has to feel worth it by the end. And that's something Frieren does really well right from the get-go. There was this comment from last week's video that stood out to me a lot. It's funny how little and how much happened in this episode at the same time. Now, this isn't the first circumstance I've seen where someone was able to come along and create a story that had so much space, a world that felt so big. The most obvious example I point towards first is Hayao Miyazaki, a director that I've made video essays about and I've seen so many other people discuss. Famous for his hyper-popular anime movies like Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke. There are scenes from his movies that in other settings would never make it past the script. Little moments that have seemingly nothing to do with the main plot or conflict. They're like a break from the story that showcases just how deep the world actually is that the characters exist in. So often, settings for stories feel like they're crafted specifically just for the protagonist. But some of my favorite Ghibli films have an incredible knack for making the world feel so much bigger than what's seen on frame. The protagonist and story we're getting to experience is just a small component of a much bigger ecosystem. There's this storytelling structure called Chekhov's gun, built around this idea that any information presented to the audience should be relevant to the story or plot. If you place a gun on the mantle in the first act and point it out to the audience, it should come back by the third. But as this became normalized, where people became more efficient with the information that they were presenting to the audience, things became a bit predictable, which led to another storytelling structure, red herrings, where you still introduce a gun hanging over the mantle in the first act, but by the third, the stand holding it up made of silver is what kills the monster, not the gun. The problem is when every component of a story that's introduced directly relates to the plot or conflict, the story beats become so obvious. And because red herrings are the most common solution for that predictability, it results in this weird binary. But then people introduce scenes that have nothing to do with the plot or conflict. This can help so much with audience immersion and suspension of disbelief. One of my favorite examples of this in Frieren is this scene from episode 2, where Frieren and Fern are having a conversation as they're walking through the woods, and they interrupt it briefly to use a log to cross a brook. It's small and in most other contexts wouldn't be included in a story, but it does make it feel so much more real. Because Frieren does something that I think a lot of other stories don't do, even Miyazaki films. I believe Frieren is a show that isn't built around plot or conflict first, and that's really uncommon. So there's those 5 fundamentals of storytelling that are taught to writers: character, theme, plot, setting, and conflict. I've argued in the past that you can take any story and rank them in order of importance, from first to fifth. Take Jurassic Park, for example, which is built around setting and conflict. It's about the dinosaurs and what happens when they escaped. Now, if I were to order these 5 elements for Frieren, there'd be 2 clear groupings. At the bottom would be plot and conflict, and at the top would be theme and character. When people are taught how to write in Western culture, more often than not, there's a central focus on conflict. A story without conflict isn't much of a story. Conflict or stakes in a story are built around 2 major components. First, consequence, and then restriction. The first being a little bit more intuitive. Stakes require risk of something bad happening, but a second very important part is restriction, the most obvious example being a time limit. Stakes in storytelling often require both, because as soon as you take one away, it loses its urgency. But Frieren's conflict is very rarely built around major consequence or restriction, often just doing one or the other. This kind of undermines the stakes, but it's a story that's not built around conflict first. Take, for example, its first 17 episodes. I'd argue only 7 of the 17 have major conflict, and if you take out that entire demon arc in the center, there's really 3 episodes with high stakes conflict. The reason, by the way, I chose the first 17 episodes is because there's a major tonal shift starting in episode 18 surrounding a tournament arc. There were 3 moments that elicited serious tension in Frieren in the first 17 episodes. The first is Fern and Frieren's fight against the great demon mage, Quall. In retrospect, it wasn't very high stakes, but they set it up really well. It kind of was a red herring. The second was Stark's fight with the dragon. And the third was Sign and Frieren's fight against the monster that caused paralysis. Normally in anime, and actually most media, there is conflict in every episode, both specific to the episode and tying into a larger A-plot conflict. And occasionally anime will break away from this, having an episode with 0 conflict, like a beach episode. Frieren is a well-received, popular show in a meta that is dominated by battle shonens, and I was able to do it as a show with very slow burn pacing, because while it didn't often go big, the moments it did were outstanding. It's careful and thought out while also throwing in so many moments that don't serve any specific plot point, because there kind of isn't any serious plot point. The A-plot in Frieren is not very important. I made an entire video exploring that idea, and it isn't even introduced until the 4th episode. But intentionality is not enough on its own. It needs to feel worth it. Because what makes Frieren good is also kind of what makes it boring. Moments that are highly emotional from situations you wouldn't quite expect. Stakes that are less predictable. Characters that feel realistic. dynamics and relationships that are intriguing in an ensemble cast that aren't built around contrived conflict. But that same emotional resonance that makes the show so outstanding can miss. The reason some people find this show boring is because if it doesn't click, it's not really worth it. Good thing for me, it was.